Good afternoon and welcome to African Travel Weekly Forum. We're hosting this with the World Tourism Forum in Lucerne and World Travel Market. And it's really to focus on the topic of biodiversity and tourism and the symbiotic relationship between biodiversity and tourism. And we do that in the context of three overarching global goals: achieving climate neutrality by 2050, preventing any species loss after 2030, and we have 10 years from now, and decisively addressing poverty and inequality and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals over the next 10 years. If we look at this relationship between biodiversity and tourism, we can see there's many positives on tourism's balance sheet for nature, but unfortunately also some negatives. And tourism hasn't always acted as a good corporate citizen in looking after its footprint and its practices. So to unpack that with us today and understand the different dimensions and talk about best practice and solutions in this new world where we face the structural break of a COVID-19 pandemic, I have five distinguished panelists with me. And I'll introduce them. I'm going to start in the top right. Luthando Ziba. Luthando is Head of Conservation at South African National Parks and also a co-chair of, I want to call it the Monumental Report, the Africa Assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And we know that the IPAS also received the Nobel Peace Prize nomination last year for its groundbreaking work on the science of biodiversity and ecosystem services. Luthando's co-chair, Emma Archer, professor at the University of Pretoria, joining us, also an instrumental contributor to this report. Then Richard Vine from Kenya. Richard is Managing Director of Olpecha Conservancy in Kenya, which I understand is the home to the last two northern white rhinos. Paul Simpkin, usually working in Somalia, but currently in Kenya. Many interests in ecotourism on the continent and doing some groundbreaking work. Then close to my home at the moment, Michael Lutzeyer, owner of Grootbos, just outside Cape Town. So before we kick off with the questions of the science and policy and economics of this, so I want to start with Luthando and Emma and ask you, how bad are we doing on biodiversity and why should we care?
I'll kick off. So basically, when we look at the African continent, which is obviously what we know best, before we look at what the future brings, we try and look at what the changes are to date. And it's clear that Africa's biodiversity is under pressure. So things are already changing. So when, for example, we look at the drivers of biodiversity change for all the sub-regions, we look at direct and indirect drivers, we see that drivers of biodiversity loss are really right across the board. And that includes drivers of biodiversity loss such as climate change, over-harvesting, and habitat conversion. So for all sub-regions, we see that drivers of biodiversity change are largely causing negative impacts on biodiversity so far.
Luthando, as a scientist and also sitting at this national park estate, what makes you most concerned?
I think, Sean, we're concerned about the loss of biodiversity, which has really been recorded, the world over. I mean, the IPBES assessments, whether at regional level or at global level, have shown significant, declines in biodiversity. But I think, coming closer to home, we are also seeing, significant and continued declines in the rhino population, for instance. We're also seeing declines in the penguin population, the African penguin population. I mean, at the beginning of the 19th century, there were over 100 million, there were over 1 million breeding pairs of penguins. Today, we're left with about, 13,500 breeding pairs. And this is something that is definitely a cause for great concern. We are also concerned about, how climate change might actually exacerbate, some of these losses. And I think, if we just look at, the pandemic, it has brought all of these into focus, that our impacts on the environment, is definitely going to come back to bite us. And I think this is something that we need to process and learn and really change the way we do things.
Thank you. Emma, just back to your focus on the vectors driving change. Do you see some of the trade-offs in Africa becoming more difficult to achieve? Also bringing in human economic systems and safety nets?
Sorry, Sean, I didn't hear you there. Do the Sustainable Development Goals?
Yes, I'm asking about the trade-offs in Africa and how it's becoming more difficult to achieve with these vectors driving change.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we're finding is, as you rightly point out, we're having to make these trade-offs between all sorts of particular stresses operating at the moment. And we do see being able to achieve those trade-offs going forward as more difficult. One of our jobs as scientists is really to provide the most up-to-date evidence to make decisions around how to make those trade-offs in the most sustainable way. But it's incredibly interesting to work with policymakers. So, for example, Berkeley Tanda and I have been privileged to work with some of the policymakers working on environment from around the African continent. And some of the most interesting questions that we've had have been around how to make decisions about these trade-offs. So, for example, putting in a large-scale infrastructure that's going to have significant impacts on both protected areas and areas adjacent to protected areas. How do you bring on board those trade-offs, not just now, but also how much do we know about the range of plausible futures and what's going to happen to the trade-offs in the future? And that's an amazing opportunity, but also a huge challenge for us as scientists to be able to bring on board information and say, okay, well, not only are these the trade-offs now, but also this is what the trade-offs are going to look like in the future. And how are we going to be able to make better decisions around that?
The science-based decision-making and science informing policy, informing best practice. So I'm going to jump to Michael here simply because I'm very aware that as a private sector, without necessarily government support, you invest quite a bit also on scientific research on your conservation estate. And Richard and Paul, please jump in after Michael if you want to also come back to science-driven decision-making.
So that's a very interesting question. In the private sector, what we are doing. We are finding that unless we are able to scientifically guide ourselves in our own policies, are we going the right way? We, as an organization that would like to exist another 50 years in our private nature reserve, in our conservancy, and trying to extend our conservancy, the way to convince people to bring them on board is to have the scientific evidence. And here we have a lot of examples about our bees that we do, forest planting, for instance. We're running a project at the moment where, as we all know, everyone wants to plant trees. And in our area, people are saying, let's connect the forests all together. And we're just doing a paleontology research to see, did the trees really grow there 12, 15,000 years ago? Or are we just jumping onto the bandwagon? Because if they didn't grow, we are doing exactly the opposite of what we are trying to do by planting trees. And I think with this kind of research in mind, we can focus much more, we can convince our partners much more, and we can bring people on board that are saying they are going in the right direction.
Thank you. Richard, Paul, did you want to contribute to it? Good. I want to, Richard, I think you're on mute.
I'm off mute now. Yeah, I mean, I would contribute a little bit. I think something that's often not. I mean, I fundamentally agree with the notion of science-based, research-based decision making. It's in areas like this, or certainly like mine, and I'm guessing places like Michael's. You know, the impact of what we do long term is often not particularly well understood. We're trying to work increasingly at a landscape scale for that reason. We understand that if we don't take measures now to prevent ourselves from becoming an ecological island, if we don't take measures now to create more space for an expanding rhino herd, then we're going to see negative impacts to biodiversity, and increasingly that is being supported by the science. But the point I'd quite like to make is that what I think we're also beginning to see is that our tourism, which funds a lot of our conservation work, tends to be more successful where we engage people who visit us in the science. And I think that's an emerging trend. People, I don't think any longer, of course there are some people, but a lot of people don't just want to come to a place and sit in the back of a bumpy, noisy, dusty Land Cruiser and see if they can find some lions and then sit by the pool in their lodge for the rest of the day. They want to be immersed, they want to understand, they want to engage. And the more you can do that, the more they become, the more they support you, the more they enjoy your product, and the more demand you have for your product, which of course then feeds back into your ability to achieve conservation. So I think that's a fundamentally important kind of dynamic that is emerging in the tourism industry, particularly in our sector.
Thank you, Paul. I think you referred to that in your opening comments on making the traveler, the consumer of his experience, part of a solution. Mute.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. Yeah, I think it's very much, I mean, we're talking about different target audiences. So our clientele are 99% they're nationals or citizens of Nairobi. And our objective is really to engage them really for the first time in nature, and so that they can see the importance of conserving the water towers, the importance of returning indigenous forests. And we're finding a lot of passion and uptake on that. And I think it's a matter of continuing to feed that. And then, so for example, in the zipline park, each zipline has a theme, one of air, one of environment, one of soil. And the idea is to educate children as they go around, and so they begin to learn more about the environment and its importance of conservation. And I think it's really beginning to work.
No, thank you. It's that also that emotional connection to nature. And I know Lutando in Sandparks, when we worked together about 15, 20 years ago, the kids in parks were an important part of the offering to really create that awareness of a material, but especially the non-material value of nature.
No, correct, Sean. And I think, I mean, we continue to have programs that engage, tourists, both in the science, but also in the conservation management work we do. But we also have a large or a big program that involves kids in parks who come and learn about their natural and cultural heritage. I think the other point that I wanted perhaps to add to what Mike was saying was one of the challenges that we have, as one of the major drivers of biodiversity loss is invasive alien species. And I think, our biggest concern, with injudicious planting, for instance, of trees, is that the tendency is usually to plant, fast-growing, trees that can easily establish, and a number of these are non-native trees that can actually have significant impacts that are negative on biodiversity. And so we do want to sound alarm around, some of these programs. They do need to be based on very sound science about, what is the native vegetation and what is good for particular biomes and ecosystems in order to be able to balance the need for climate mitigation, but also for managing biodiversity without compromising ecosystem services associated with some of these grasslands, for instance, which are some of our water factories in the country.
Thank you. And maybe just on the last question around involving the traveler, the tourist in our efforts, Michael, when I visited Grootbos, I've always been impressed that both on the social inclusion side, but also the environmental side, how you involve travelers.
Yes, I think I want to come back to what Paul and Lutando both said is, I think we always talk about storytelling. And I think it's the stories that are fascinating for the guests, the in-depth stories. And for Krotbos, of course, being only botanically based, for us, we don't have lions and elephants. So we have to find the stories, and the stories usually start with fire, for instance, what a role fire plays, what a role the insects play, what a role the environment plays, what a role water plays. And I think that is inherent in the human being, especially if we have our tourists from overseas that have lost 70% of their insects. And then all of a sudden realize that these are the major pollinators, for instance, for all our plant species that we have here. So believe it or not, 3 years ago, we introduced 2 entomologists. And up to now, we've collected 24,000 species of insects, which we pin, and we take it to the children. We put them under a microscope, and you see it on a television screen, a massive television screen. And all of a sudden, these insects that one would normally just hit on a table or shoo away become a major role. And people are starting to be fascinated about the small things, the impact they can have. Often we talk about a global warming, for instance. So what can the normal person actually do to prevent it? But coming to places that we are in this group talking about, people with these stories feel they can take part. They might go back to Europe and say, this is what I can do in my garden. I can start a movement in my own garden. And I think that is what we are trying to do. In general, all of us here, is to take our intact nature and bring it back to our foreign guests. The community I'll talk about later.
We'll come back to the community. Before we talk about communities, maybe just to get to the economic trade-offs. We all know that tourism is a major source of revenue for conservation. In a country like Seychelles, 25% of jobs and 55% of GDP depend on tourism and depend on a nature-based conservation. Wildlife tourism contributes before COVID hit, $29 billion annually and 3.6 million job opportunities in Africa. So I want to maybe start with you, Lutando, and ask you about the business model behind conservation. In the case of sandparks, if I recall correctly, you get about 20% of your funding from government and 80% from tourism and the private sector. How did COVID change this? And how do you move forward?
Very interesting question, Sean. I think, you're correct to say that we were quite reliant on tourism revenue as an organization. Our budget for the year 2020, 2021 was close to 3 billion rands, and about 80% of that, expected from tourism revenue. Obviously, that changed quite dramatically with the pandemic. And we've had to basically find, coping strategies, because this is basically a new, and really uncharted waters for South African national parks. I think it has brought to the fore the question of, that model, which is reliant on basically a single revenue stream, if I were to characterize that. And now it brings to question as to, how do we diversify, our income streams so that we may be able to be more resilient in the face of, significant, perturbations or disturbances such as we have experienced with the pandemic. I must say, though, that thankfully, when opportunity avails, as in when conditions permitted for travel, or when regulations were permitting, whenever those conditions permitted, South Africans have visited our national parks. One of the benefits, I think, about South Africa is that about 75% of our visitors to national parks are actually South Africans. And so that is a strong, base. And I think, it makes one appreciate the fact that we are blessed to have so much beauty, just outside our doorstep. And many people who have longed to go out and have been, under lockdown have really reached out and visited our national parks. And I hope private nature reserves, Mike, and as well, have benefited from the longing from people just wanting to get out. So that has been good. But we've also received government support, because we did appeal to the fact that we are managing the National Conservation Estate, which is the public good. And if we are not generating income, that definitely, we still have a responsibility to manage and deliver on this public good mandate. And I think, we share, the pain of private sector partners and private entities who have had also to bear, the brunt of the pandemic, with people not able to travel, and in many respects, appreciate the fact that entities like Grootbos have been able to continue doing business. We have concessionaires in our national park who are private sector owners who run some of our top lodges, and these have been significantly affected, and we have made arrangements that are considerate of the impacts of the pandemic to enable them to continue doing business. So I think we are keen on diversifying and looking at models that enable us to be much more resilient in the face of challenging times such as this one.
Thank you, Ntando. I think that the resiliency of a business model and diversifying, and also the message to governments, and clearly the South African government playing a leading role in that regard, is if we destroy this upstream reservoir for future growth in tourism now, we won't get it back. And we're taking decisions on economic subsidies and stimulus measures now, but it'll define the relationship between tourism, nature, economy, people, jobs for decades to come. Richard and Paul, from where you sit in Kenya and Somalia, do you want to add to how this model has changed?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating conversation. Of course, we're all caught in the same COVID trap to a greater or lesser extent. I would just make 2 points. I think going back to the that integrated approach to land use that I talked about earlier, which certainly has taken root here in the private conservancy sector of Kenya. I think that it's very interesting for me, because therein lie trade-offs that I think were talked about earlier. By having cattle, we probably are not as attractive to some tourists as a pure kind of African wilderness area. Similarly, our cattle are probably not as productive as they might be if they were farmed in the absence of wildlife. But what's interesting is if you put the two together on a per acre basis, we end up being more productive, not only financially, not only in terms of our ability to employ people and be politically acceptable, but also in terms of the in terms of the fact that we are still in that system. We may not have 100% of the biodiversity that perhaps previously existed or could exist in the absence of a farming operation, but we're still retaining 90% of it, and we're retaining 90% of it in a manner that is productive and can withstand the shocks to tourism that certainly in this part of the world we see on a regular basis. My second point is that I do think there's a lot of room for innovation going forwards. Just one simple example, but there are many others. We've started a thing called the virtual classroom, and it's very straightforward, but it's live streaming of the feeding times of the northern white rhinos, of which there are only 2 left in the world. Now that live streaming can be sold for not very much money to classrooms all over the world, where we can talk about extinction using the rhinos as a platform. And it's gaining a lot of traction, and I'm sure that as we go forwards, those kinds of virtual opportunities for a global audience, where the global audience is not having to travel to Africa to experience them, is going to be a real growth area that we should all be looking at. And I think there are other opportunities around those areas with modern technology that we should all be thinking about.
Emma, I see you nodding, and I see Paul nodding.
Yes, I think so much of the really interesting things. I mean, I spoke about a a range of land uses, all the way from formal protected areas through to extensive and intensive agriculture. And I hope that something that we're becoming better at doing is understanding the concept of in situ conservation of biodiversity in agriculture, for example, so that we recognize that biodiversity in formal protected areas is incredibly important, but also that we can undertake measures to conserve biodiversity within other types of land uses, and that all of this can be better integrated and better aligned.
Thank you. Emma, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. I'd just like to underline, I do think that the rooms of diversification, innovation are very, very important. And there's some interesting opportunities being presented by the revitalization of the carbon markets. How can tourism ventures and conservation ventures tap into this? The danger is, of course, going out and planting lots of pine trees and simply going for the tonnage as opposed to going for indigenous species and so on. So, but if it intelligently approached with a way that also hits and meets the SDGs, so you're looking at involving and engaging communities, involving and engaging people's understanding, there is a passion and there is an appetite for that out there. Quickly on COVID, I think, yes, everyone's been hit on this. It's been particularly tough for Africa. Because the larger proportion of the income has been foreigners coming from Europe and from the States. However, I think what's been quite clever, and we've seen the Kenyan government were really quite inventive. They started slashing access rates to the national parks. Hotels, the ones that did survive, many did suffer. Also looked at reducing rates, giving different packages for citizens and so on. And for the first time, you had Kenyans were the majority in the Masai Mara. For the first time, you actually had Kenyans traveling and going out to see their own country, where they wouldn't have dreamt of going to the Masai Mara before. It was something you had to fly on an airplane. Now you hit traffic jams driving down to Mara on the weekends, and then midweek it's empty. But it's actually quite a nice phenomenon that's come out of this, and I think that this can be built upon and further extended. Thank you.
Good. So we've got about 15 minutes left, and I want to come to the critical stakeholder that we haven't spoken too much about yet, and that's the communities. We've spoken about public-private partnerships. We've spoken about the role of a consumer, of a tourist, of a traveler, but communities were extremely hardly hit by the drop in revenue from tourism in protected areas, and they often bear the opportunity costs for these natural assets that we sell in the tourism industry. So maybe, you know, Michael, I know you've got some projects to involve communities in delivery in different ways, and so I would love to learn a little bit about what's innovative, and I love the spirit of innovation, but I hear that you know, what's the new models to involve communities and really empower communities.
It's a very interesting question, because up to now, that is something we are starting to veer into a new direction. We've always helped the communities, we've got engaged. So we have sport projects, we've built mini hospitals, we've done early learning centers, we've done gardening schools. The question that we are asking ourselves now is, by forming conservancies and trying to form protected areas, how do we do the training for the youngsters in future so that we are able to employ them in the work that we are doing here? So not so much anymore helping the community, maybe in, not when I'm saying not in sport, but educating them much more so that the future young people we are able to employ. And that's why what I enjoyed, or what Richard was saying earlier, we've got to get away from the idea that a protected area is only for us. When I say only for us, it's for everyone. And how can we benefit from a protected area, which we call the green economy? How can we, why can't people harvest sour figs at our place? Why couldn't the community put up their own beehives and sell the honey? Why couldn't they collect thatch and then sell the thatch to build thatch houses? Who's going to look after our roads? And who's going to do the fire control burns? How can they get involved more with our guests? So I think that you in Kenya are a little bit further away, and we have to get away from the idea if we are a nature reserve, it has to be wholly a nature reserve. We have to share what's in the nature reserve with the communities. We have to educate the communities that we can only use small parts of it and don't overharvest or overgraze things. And that, I think, is the future where we are all heading for in tourism. The same people will then be getting engaged with our tourists. And that is then real Africa.
Well, thank you, Michael. You know, it always impresses me how in Grootbos, communities are not seen as a CSR, but they're integral to the delivery model and the business model, and it's a true partnership. Lutando, it takes me to Sandparks, and you know, having visited Isimangaliso and Kruger and the other parks over the years, you've got a particularly special relationship with communities. Do you fear that those communities adjacent to protected areas without social safety nets may resort to unsustainable alternatives in the face of the loss of tourism revenue?
I think, I mean, we do have concerns, and I think some of them like have materialized around, you know, how food insecurity might actually force people to engage in activities that might actually compromise, for instance, you know, national parks or at least aspects of, you know, the biodiversity that we manage. For instance, people poaching in order to just meet their, you know, daily, you know, needs for food. But I think we mitigated some of this by an outreach program, particularly at the peak of the pandemic, where we reached out to communities and provided food parcels, and also engaged with NGO partners that actually were helping communities to establish food gardens. But I think we have a much bigger program that deals with you know, land claims and beneficiation of communities adjacent to national parks. And through various agreements, we are now starting to look at, you know, private public partnerships that include communities as partners and shareholders in some of our, you know, new facilities. For instance, in Skukuza, we've got the Skukuza Lodge, and any partner who's going to manage Skukuza Lodge must make a provision for a 10% share for communities, you know, like that are basically adjacent to Kruger as part of the shareholders in that lodge. And we are looking at expanding some of these opportunities even further. We also are looking at, when we are looking at expansion opportunities now, we are also looking at community land. How do we integrate community land under conservation and then develop a shareholder model so that communities have a direct benefit from, you know, activities, you know, whether they be tourism or other ventures that are taking place on their land in a shared contractual model with national parks. And we've got good examples of some of those, for instance, in Northern Kruger and other, like, I mean, national parks. And one of the things that I think is key, which is something that we are starting to talk about at some parks, relates to what Richard was talking about, of these integrated landscapes where you don't exclude other land uses, but you actually bring in, you enhance, you know, the efficiency of use of parts of the landscape in order to create opportunities for conservation in the broader landscape. And actually, we've even dared to say, could we get to situations within the next couple of years where we can actually give rhinos to communities and work with communities to manage a healthy rhino and growing rhino population on their own land, that where they can also do in parts of it agriculture and sustain other, like, I mean, livelihoods within that particular landscape. So I think we are basically looking at ways of ensuring that communities feel ownership of national parks and protected areas adjacent to them, and not feel that, you know, they belong to government and we are excluded from these.
Sorry, I missed my own sound there. Richard, in Kenya, do you see a similar trend in the model behind this changing?
Yeah, no, 100%. 100%. There's a fascinating dynamic in Kenya, which is, it's been referred to as the scramble for conservancies. There are now 100, I think it's about 160 registered conservancies. And of course, some are more on paper than they are in practice, but nevertheless, it's a signal to the idea of communities taking their land and wanting to make them into conservancies. And they're doing it in a way which is integrated. They're doing it in a way which provides positive trade-offs to biodiversity at the same time as maintaining livelihood opportunity. So I think it's got a long way to go. Of course, it's as much about social issues as it is about wildlife, as it is about biodiversity and the environment. But it's nevertheless a really strong movement that has taken root here. The other small point I would make, and I think I'm going to throw a stone into the pool and see where the ripples come back. But if we as conservationists can get away from this idea that conservation is sort of something that has to happen at massive opportunity cost, and instead, and South Africa has done brilliantly in this regard, but it's not something that is replicated in places like Kenya. Instead, if we can see conservation as a kind of profit-making opportunity, where you conserve biodiversity and you make a profit in the process, and then you have, the opportunity, and this is something that we're exploring at the moment, the opportunity to publicly list, for example, where Kenyans own this company through the stock exchange. Biodiversity is conserved in the process, and they make a return in the form of a dividend and increasing the value of their shares increasing. So, can we begin to get really adventurous about the way that we think about how biodiversity should be conserved for the future? I don't think it's going to be enough just to depend upon the largesse of tourism and or philanthropy, which is a big part of our model here in Kenya. We've got to think out of the box with some different models which do exactly what this panel is talking about, and that is to put responsibility into the hands of people.
Good, thank you. Paul, did you want to come in on that?
Very quickly, I mean, it's a struggle. Land pressure is very intense in many parts of Africa, from Ethiopia to Kenya to all these population growth is requiring families to actually also be inventive and invade land and occupy land simply to live. And so it really is the economic viability of the game reserves, and hence I think, as Michael was saying, the idea of Michael and others were saying, the idea of actually making these economically viable and economically interesting so that there is sufficient political protection. Without that, it is going to be a struggle. It's going to get more and more difficult.
Good. So we've got about 3 minutes left. So I want to maybe in reverse order, starting with Michael, ask you for a parting shot. What is your message to government or to the rest of industry on the urgency of action, and what gives you hope?
I tell you what gives me hope. What gives me hope is that we are all sitting on gold mines, but not gold mines for ourselves, but on a gold mine for humankind. We are sitting on nature, the most precious thing that everyone inherently wants to be part of. And that's why if we can manage it, if we can draw everyone in, we are on a winning streak. I'd hate to own a mine now or bank now. We are the hottest topic there is at the moment, especially coming out of COVID.
Thank you, Michael. Paul, 20 seconds.
Simply, I agree with that, what Michael still said. I think nature's fun and people love it and they really enjoy it. And let's build on that. So we're not exploiting it, we're actually sharing as much as we can.
I think it's a Jamaican tourism minister, Edmund Bartlett, that coined the term Gen Z, the COVID generation, wanting to reconnect with culture, heritage, nature, and these immersive environments. Richard?
Yeah, no, I agree with both Paul and Michael. I suppose my parting shot would be something along the lines of conservation, or the maintenance of biodiversity should be the most important business in the world, far more important and relevant than banking or any other industry. And I think actually we're beginning to transition in that direction. And I think that augurs well for the future.
Emma?
I suppose it's just that, we've had this extraordinary lesson in the last year around the extent to which climate, biodiversity, sustainable development are not academic issues. And that, what gives me hope is that I think the notion of a radical transition in biodiversity and ecosystem services, we are moving closer to that. We understand now that biodiversity and ecosystem services are not merely academic, they're not merely a luxury, but are the foundation of a healthy planet.
Lutan, the last word to you.
Yeah, I think I share the sentiments about hope for the future, but I also think that the most immediate and urgent message is that we need to do our best to halt the decline of biodiversity. We also need to do our best to look after ourselves and our families, to keep safe and prevent future waves of the pandemic, so that we can get out and enjoy nature more. Our national parks, our private nature reserves, are ready to welcome people who want to reconnect with nature, and we look forward to having them visit our national parks.
Thank you very much. There's no way I can summarize this panel discussion in 1 minute, but I would like to pull together maybe just 5 quick themes that I picked up. One is the sense of urgency. The rate of species loss urges us to take action, and it's probably biodiversity loss is as important a global crisis, an existential crisis, as is climate change and health pandemics. And the need for intersectoral approaches, not looking at this at silos, but across the spectrum. The second is biodiversity needs tourism, and tourism needs biodiversity to flourish, but biodiversity cannot depend only on tourism. And we need to look at diversifying and new radical models, especially after the structural break that COVID brought onto us. The third theme for me would be true stewardship involves communities. It's not about zero impact or mitigating impact, but it's about making a positive impact, economic, social, ecological. The fourth message for me was it's about people, making the traveler, the tourist part of a solution, young people, and community integration in integrated models. And the final one, the message around innovation and diversification and looking at resilient and robust business models behind all of this. And it reminded me of a quote, it's attributed to a South African CEO who once said that when there's a storm, you cannot wait for the storm to pass. You must learn to dance in the rain. And I think whether we're in conservation or whether we're in tourism or whatever industry, what I've seen over the last year, over the last few months is leaders saying, let's learn to dance in the rain and adapt to the new realities. So thank you very much for your time today and for contributing to this conversation. Thank you.